The parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is nicknamed rest and digest. So it is controlling functions that tend to be slowing down functions. So if you're thinking of heart rate, for example, the slowing of the heart rate would fall into the rest category or be under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system. Lowering blood pressure. So think of the parasympathetic nervous system. If you just look at any particular function and think, what would the resting state or a digestive state be? And you can pretty much predict where there's parasympathetic control. The parasympathetic nervous system has a different anatomy from the sympathetic nervous system as well. In the case of the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic fibers tend to come out of the spinal cord at the top and at the bottom. So at the cranial vertebra and at the sacral regions of the spinal cord, as versus in the middle tends to be more sympathetic nervous system. Also, the preganglionic fibers, you remember that the autonomic nervous system always has two neurons going from the spinal cord out to the end target effector. The preganglionic neuron, or the first one that's leaving the spinal cord, tends to be fairly long in the parasympathetic nervous system. So it'll in fact go almost all the way to the target cells and then synapse onto other neurons that go directly to the cells. This tends to make the parasympathetic nervous system a little more specific because it's getting closer to the end organ. So rather than releasing neurotransmitter on a sort of wide area, it tends to be targeted to a specific place. Not as targeted as the motor nervous, the somatic part of the motor nervous system, because the somatic part has one neuron going exactly to one muscle fiber. You're not having that here, but it's a little more specific than the sympathetic portion. There also isn't that much neuronal divergence in the parasympathetic nervous system. So what that means is one neuron leaving the spinal cord will synapse on just a couple of postsynaptic neurons. So you only get a couple of ways in which neurons that can send signals out. The sympathetic nervous system has much more divergence. One preganglionic neuron could synapse on 10, 12, 14 postsynaptic neurons. Again, making this parasympathetic system much more specific. A given signal is only going to go a couple of places, as versus sympathetic, where a given signal gets lots of divergence and goes lots of different places. So it's a little more selective in the target and local to where that target is than the sympathetic system. So here's an illustration of the neurons are leaving at the cranial portion at the top. The ones that are coming toward me, the neurons coming toward me, are the parasympathetic. So you can see that they're leaving at the cranial portion and the sacral portion, whereas the sympathetic fibers are going away from me and they're leaving more at the thoracolumbar portions of the spinal cord. And you can see that the fibers, the preganglionic fibers, go a long way, whereas in the sympathetic system on the other side, they go just a short way from the spinal cord and then they synapse and the second neuron takes over. However, if you look at the left side of this versus the right side, the same organs are illustrated. So for example, there is parasympathetic control of the pancreas and sympathetic control of the pancreas. The neurons are just coming from very different places in the spinal cord. This is interesting in that if you end up with a spinal cord injury, you could end up losing sympathetic but not parasympathetic control of a given organ. So the types of neurotransmitters that are released and the receptors for them that are on the target cells really determine the effects of the autonomic nervous system. In the somatic nervous system controlling muscles that you learned before, when acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that is released, you remember that the acetylcholine, right there in the neuromuscular junction, there's an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase that can break it down rapidly. So when acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter used, and in fact, in the parasympathetic nervous system, acetylcholine is the main neurotransmitter. So acetylcholinesterase is still present, can still break it down. So the effects of the parasympathetic nervous system are not as long-lasting because there's an enzyme right there and ready to break down the neurotransmitter. The receptors for acetylcholine in the somatic motor system that you studied before, the receptors were all a nicotinic type receptor. Nicotinic type receptors are the kind that are always released from the neuromuscular junction. The acetylcholine that's released from the neuromuscular junction always binds to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And if you remember, those receptors always trigger depolarization of the skeletal muscle and contraction of the muscle. So wherever there are nicotinic receptors, and this is true of all postganglionic neurons, so at the synapse, there are always, so we're looking at, here's the first neuron to leave the spinal cord. That neuron always releases acetylcholine, both parasympathetic and sympathetic system. It always releases acetylcholine. And the receptors that are present on this second neuron, the postganglionic neuron, are always nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So acetylcholine released always binds to those nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, triggers depolarization of that postganglionic neuron. In the parasympathetic system, that postganglionic neuron pretty much also always releases acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter. The trick is that the receptors on the target organ, so on the heart or on the smooth muscle of your digestive tract, are a different kind of receptor called muscarinic receptors. They still bind acetylcholine, but in this case, depending on what kind of muscarinic receptor there are, and there are several different kinds, you can sometimes get depolarization, sometimes you'll actually get hyperpolarization. So sometimes they're activating, sometimes they're inactivating, or you could call them excitatory or inhibitory. So in the case of nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, it's always excitatory. And those nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are always found at the postganglionic neuron, at the synapse between the first neuron and the second neuron in autonomic nervous system, whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic. But on the target cell of the parasympathetic nervous system, you've got a different kind of acetylcholine receptor that is muscarinic. Sometimes they're excitatory, sometimes they're inhibitory. Some organs just have parasympathetic innervation. So there are only muscarinic acetylcholine receptors on those target organs, and they're not responsive to sympathetic signals at all. Examples of those are your lacrimal glands making tears. Tear production is part of the parasympathetic system. The bladder wall, so being able to contract the bladder wall is a parasympathetic function, and there are no sympathetic receptors there. And some reproductive glands making reproductive juices from the reproductive system are only parasympathetic. There are some that are only sympathetic. Sweat glands, so if you think of sweat as a fight or flight sort of function, sweat glands really don't have parasympathetic innervation. Adipose tissue, interestingly enough, is only sympathetic stimulation, as well as the adrenal medulla. Really, the adrenal medulla is a modified sympathetic gland, so really only sympathetic. And the kidneys, interestingly enough, have only sympathetic innervation. There are many, many drugs that actually work in the autonomic nervous system, and you can imagine that's true, right? Control of heart rate, control of breathing, control of blood pressure are really important functions. we call any drugs that enhance the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system parasympathomimetics. And that name kind of makes sense, right? It's in the parasympathetic system, and it's mimicking the parasympathetic system. An example of that is there's a drug that relieves glaucoma by dilating the vessel that will allow fluid to drain from the eye, and that's a parasympathomimetic. You can also get drugs that will suppress parasympathetic activity. They're called parasympatholytics, so lysis or stopping of the parasympathetic system. There's a drug called atropine that will block muscarinic receptors that they can use to dilate pupils for eye exams as one example. There are many more.